Thank you for joining us here at Dartmouth for tonight's event, Dissidence and Democracy in Russia, a Work in Progress. And greetings to our online audience as well. I'm Victoria Holt. I'm the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding here at Dartmouth College, and I'm very excited and humbled to introduce tonight's event, including our topic, the speakers. So this event is co-sponsored by the Dickey Center, but in great collaboration with the Department of East European, Eurasian, and Russian Studies. Wonderful colleagues here who are really some of the people that we could host this event with. We've also had support from Mary and Peter Dallman's fund, which was dedicated to great issues, discussions, and lectures here at Dartmouth. And it's also part of our Dissent in Democracy project, which aims to bring international dissidents to campus to talk to us about what it means to stand up for political freedom and rights, and the challenges they faced, the hardships they faced, and their thoughts for all of us in a time when a lot of democracy around the world is deeply challenged. One of our goals at the Dickey Center is to live up to the mandate by former President Dickey, who came to Dartmouth after World War II. And he famously said, and many of us know this, that the world's problems are our problems. And there's nothing that better humans, well equipped with tools and reasoning, cannot take on. And I think we try and carry that forward, not just tonight, but in general in our work. So in a moment, I'll turn to our amazing speakers. Vladimir Kara-Murza, Evgenia Kara-Murza, and Tikhon Dzyadko. And we also have professors from Dartmouth, Lynn Pachek and Stuart Finkel, who will be moderating the conversation. But I briefly want to just point out that if you look at the news today, and I even just saw a story that the Wall Street Journal is reporting, citing intelligence and undisclosed sources, that a grim milestone has been made. About 1 million people, both from Russia and Ukraine, have died in that conflict since the intervention in 2022. So the consequences of Russia's behavior and the ability to speak up about this conflict is something that is very real to all of us. It's not just also conflict, but the conditions for the citizens of Russia in their pursuit of democracy and political freedoms and the costs that they face in trying to call out for change. You'll hear more about that today. But I want to let you know that our Russian guests today have been confronted with often gut-wrenching choices, kind of choices that frankly few of us have had to make, but that affect all of us in how we make decisions in our own lives about healthy disease and what the cost might be and what we are trying to achieve. So now to our speakers. First of all, many of us have heard of TV Rain and its editor-in-chief, Tikhon Dzyadko. TV Rain is well known. It is very famous around the world. I understand it garners roughly 20 million followers. Is that the correct number? Million views per month from a global audience. He started his career in journalism in radio, the independent radio station The Echo of Moscow. He's also worked in Washington, D.C. As deputy editor-in-chief for New York-based independent Russian language station RTVI. He returned, however, in 2019 to become TV Rain's editor-in-chief. But about the same time, the station had been forced off the Russian airways due to its coverage of the war in Ukraine and Donbass, and TV Rain has since made much of its home on YouTube. The past decade, TV Rain has also been resilient in the face of multiple challenges and threats to its existence. Since 2023, it must broadcast in exile from Amsterdam. Now, many of you know about our next two speakers. It was famous in the news on August 1st, one of the largest prisoner swaps in the history of the United States and Russia since the end of World War II. And that came, many of us saw the shot in the Oval Office of Evgenia taking a call from her husband, who was just being released, standing there with President Biden. Evgenia herself has studied at Moscow State Linguistic University. She's a translator, interpreter. She's had a career working with NGOs, independent human rights organizations. Also is today the director of international advocacy for the Free Russia Foundation, where she continues to work tirelessly for multilateral oversight mechanisms to hold the Russian government to account for violating its international commitments on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. She has really won international recognition as a relentless advocate and an effective one, having won the Magninsky Human Rights Award, the Democracy Service Medal from the National Endowment for Democracy, and most recently, the Lantos Human Rights Prize. And she's also very passionate about looking after also lesser-known Russian political prisoners who remain in captivity today. She's also one of the best advocates for her husband, who was just released from prison a little over 2 months ago. Vladimir Kara-Murza has been a Russian politician, oppositionist, and pro-democracy and human rights activist for more than 2 decades. He's also, I don't know how you manage this, a Pulitzer-prize winning columnist for the Washington Post, which include being a journalist while in prison, if I understand it, as well as a documentary filmmaker. He also has a BA and MA from the University of Cambridge and is a historian, which will come up in our conversation. And he's been a member of many liberal and parties and coalitions since I think he first ran at the age of 22, one of the youngest people to ever run for the Duma. He successfully lobbied in Washington, together with Boris Nemtsov, to pass the Medjinsky Act, which was in 2012. Many of us know about that as well. But perhaps what we know is what he has suffered, which includes being poisoned twice, both in 2015 and 2017, with suspicions pointing to the same FSB unit that poisoned Alex Navalny in 2020. Despite all this, he returned to Russia in 2022 after the war began again in Ukraine, and he was arrested with discrediting the Russian military and put in jail. And we will hear more about that. So we are in the able hands of 2 fantastic Dartmouth professors who will moderate today's conversation. Stuart Finkel, he's also in East European, Eurasian, and Russian studies, also a historian himself, teaches courses on Russian and Soviet history and culture. I think he has also been working on a long-term project on advocacy on looking at the advocacy for political prisoners in Russia and the Soviet Union. His first book was a project that came out and said on revolutionary philanthropy, aid to political prisoners and exiles in late imperial Russia. I think that was just issued by Oxford University Press this summer. Also with us is Lynn Pacek, who is the chair of the Department of East European, Eurasian, Russian Studies. Her work focuses on the interaction of politics, the arts, and media in Russia from the 19th to 21st century. She's interested in the strategies and tactics of democratic movements and the struggle against autocracy, as well as the tactics of state and police repression. Among her favorite courses, and I love these titles, are Dostoevsky and the Problem of Evil, Who is the Terrorist, and the Age of Brainwashing. So you are in excellent hands with this fascinating group of people. Just a quick on logistics. I think the moderators will start with a moderated discussion, and then we will welcome the audience at the moderator's direction to take questions, and you'll see microphones on both sides, which will be just easy to stand up. So please join me in welcoming our guests and our moderators.
Thank you, Lori. All right, I'm going to start us off, and what I'd like to do now for you all is to set the stage. So I want to give our audience more detail and a sort of first-person narrative from our guests today of what kind of work they were doing, what kind of work you were doing before February 24th, 2022, with the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. And what were the possibilities, the constraints, the challenges, the dangers, and the risks of the work that you were doing? And how did things change after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine? What choices did you have to make? What personal choices did you make? And what led you to choose that path? So I'm going to start with Tikhon.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here. It's such a pleasure and honor. Before the beginning of the full-scale invasion, I was an editor-in-chief of TRA, and TRA was one and only independent Russian TV station. Back then, before the war, there wasn't freedom of speech in Russia, but Russian government tried to pretend to be a democracy, tried to pretend that there are some institutions and that there are some normal democratic processes in Russia. So that's why we had one independent newspaper in Russia, Novaya Gazeta, one independent radio station, Echo Moskvy, Echo of Moscow, and one independent TV station, TVRA. Even though TVRA was banned from being in big cable and satellite networks, even though TVRA was labeled as a so-called foreign agent in Russia, we still had the possibility to work. We had a beautiful office in the center of Moscow. Our reporters were reporting from different regions, etc., etc. And of course, our coverage was absolutely honest, and it was completely different from how Russian state media was covering the situation in Russia and in the whole world. And we saw that our audience was growing. We were covering the major events such as amendments to the Russian Constitution, the protests in Belarus, the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, the rallies in Moscow right after he returned to Moscow and the arrest of Navalny, etc., etc., etc. We knew that we were annoying for the Russian government, but still they were trying to pretend that there is some kind of democracy in Moscow, in Russia. After the beginning of the full-scale invasion, everything has changed. When you drop bombs at the civilians in a NATO country, there is no need to pretend that you are a good guy, because everyone sees that you are not a good guy, and there is no need to pretend that you have freedom of speech in Russia. One reason. The second reason is that Vladimir Putin was made by the media. And that's why he understands the strength of the media. He understands that if people hear something from the media, they will change their opinions. So just like one of his first actions when he became a president was the attack on the independent TV station NTV, just like that, he, after declaring so-called special military operations in Spain, he started one year with another war with freedom of speech and expression in Russia. On March 1st, on the morning of the beginning of the war, I was on air. It's telling events, and I got a call from Roskomnadzor. Roskomnadzor, it's the Russian Ministry of Censorship. It was the first time when I talked to them. And it was a funny conversation because the lady from Roskomnadzor, she was very polite with me, and she said, Tikhon Viktorovich, I know how professional you are. And I said, Tatiana Petrovna, I know how professional you are. She said, well, you see that situation is very difficult. And I said, yes, Tatiana, the situation is very difficult. And she said, well, it's so important not to spread fake news information. And I said, of course. And that's why when we see that Russia is bombing Ukraine, we report that Russia is bombing Ukraine. And she said, okay, Tikhon Viktorovich, I hope that everything will be fine. And I thought, okay, everything will not be. 5 days after this conversation, I left Russia. At the end of the first week of the invasion, Russian Duma adopted 2 legislations. The first one was about the so-called discreditation of Russian soldiers in Ukraine. And the second one is about spreading fake news information about in Ukraine. What does this mean? It means that if you say something which was not approved by the Russian Ministry of Defense, then you are in trouble, because you are spreading false fake news information about military activities by the Russian army in Ukraine. So we had a choice. We had 2 options. The first, continue working like we've been working over last since the beginning of the tyranny in 2010, and go to jail soon because we would spread fake news information. The second option was to become basically the part of the Department of Information of Russian Ministry of Defense, because the only thing we were allowed to tell were like press releases of Russian Ministry of Defense. We took the third option. We decided to stop operating. Our website was already blocked. We were cut off the cable network in Russia, and we decided to stop operations. We left the country. Around 70 people from our team left with us. First Turkey, then Georgia, and then Riga, Latvia, and then in 2023, Amsterdam, Netherlands. Now we are there in Amsterdam. We are working there with a Dutch license. We have a Dutch company, but still we are Russian independent city because we are mostly focused on Russian use. We are mostly focused on a Russian audience. 60% of our audience is from Russia. It's around 15 million viewers, not views, unique viewers per month, which is a lot. And we continue working despite all the obstacles from the Russian government. For example, last year we were declared so-called undesirable organization, which means we are criminals. But it's not a reason for us to stop doing what we've been doing over last years.
Great, thank you. So we're just going to go in the rows. So Vladimir.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here in this beautiful college, and thank you to everyone who's here for their involvement, for your interest, and for caring about the issues that are so important to all of us. And much education that I've been doing what I do for about 25 years. In November 1999, I came to work with Boris Nemtsov, who was a former deputy prime minister of Russia, who became the most prominent, the most important, the most effective political opposition leader to Vladimir Putin, who's led the Russian pro-democracy. And then nominally Putin came to power. Now, these last 25 years that I've been involved in politics have also been the years when Russia was transformed from the flawed and imperfect democracy that we had before Putin came to power to the perfect repressive dictatorship that it is today. And this process started really early on. Literally on the third day of his inauguration, Vladimir Putin sent armed operatives from the tax police and security services to raid the offices of the largest independent media outlet, or media house, which included TV, We'll have a saying in Russian, кто нас обидит, 3 дня не проживет. He who offends us will not survive for 3 days. And very literally, in line with that saying, within 1 year, TV was taken over by the state. 2 years of Vladimir Putin's rule, all independent television networks were either taken over by the state or switched off. The broadcast elections were turned into meaningless rituals with predetermined results. Parliament was turned into a rubber stamp. I think one of the phrases that will go down in future history books as a sort of a custom description of the Putin regime is a phrase that was uttered in December 2003 by the then Speaker of the Russian Duma, who said that, quote, Parliament is not a place for discussion. Mr. Putin began to move to persecute and harass his political opponents, then imprison his political opponents, and then to murder his political opponents. In February of 2015, nearly 10 years ago, Boris Nemtsov was assassinated on a bridge, literally in front of the Kremlin wall, in what was, at that time, the most high-profile political assassination in history of modern Russia. This list was added with the assassination of Alexei Navalny, also at Putin's orders, in February of this year. So when I began to to live in the political world, I was expecting to have, what people in normal countries think of as being involved in politics, to put forward your views, to debate your ideas in a free market of thoughts and ideas, to run for office, to try to serve your country in the best capacity that you can. But of course, very quickly, all of these opportunities became non-existent. And as Tikhon already mentioned in reference to the situation that we have in Russia today, we have now, to freedom of information, we have no freedom of election, we have freedom of assembly, we have no freedom of association, nothing. And so, very quickly, the political opposition work became something very similar to what we had back in the Soviet times, where people who opposed the regime were widely known as dissidents, the Soviet dissident movement. That actually had been one of my major areas of study as a historian. I sort of sometimes said that every historian subconsciously wishes to personally experience the period of political study. That is true, I got my wish to the full, including solitary confinement in maximum security prison. So this is what I've been doing for the last quarter of a century in different ways, in different shapes, in different forms. As Victoria mentioned in her kind introduction, one of the areas of work which I'm most proud of in my political biography is work on the Magnitsky rules, on the targeted sanctions that were imposed by several Western countries against corrupt officials and human rights abusers, initially in Russia, but then this principle was expanded to all over the world. And the principle behind these sanctions was that those individuals who, based on corroborated evidence, have been personally involved in human rights abuses or corruption, will no longer be able to get visas, own assets, or use the banking and financial systems of Western democratic countries. Because the system that we had in Russia for years and years under the Putin regime was that the same people who abused and attacked and undermined the most basic norms of democracy in the rule of all that country had came to your countries in the West and enjoyed the benefits and privileges and opportunities that life in my Western societies offer. This is what is. This is major in this hypocrisy and spectrum. And so back in 2010, I began this work alongside and led by Boris Nemtsov, who did initially the United States office, then other Western countries, that this enabling has to stop. And there must be finally some personal accountability for these people who have long made a habit of stealing in Russia and in the West. Because for years and years, it's no secret to anybody that the operatives and oligarchs of the Putin regime have this account. So they have their bank accounts, their villas, their yachts, and their families, and so on and so forth. And I'm proud of that work. I'm proud of that achievement. I'm proud of the fact that despite the odds, despite being told that it's never going to happen because it doesn't get the people out it brings up today. The business as usual lobby is too strong. And that is all true. But I'm proud to say that today, 35 countries have Magnitsky laws on their book, how they started sanctions mechanisms enacted. And not just in relation to Russia, but in relation to any authoritarian regime in the world that abuses the rights and freedoms of its own citizens. And then in aggression related to what changed in February 2022. I know that the full-scale invasion of Ukraine came as a surprise, as a shock to me, both Russia and Serbia. But I have to say, honestly, it did not come as a shock and a surprise. It did not come as a shock and a surprise to us. We did ask whether we needed mics. Because, it's really strange to me to still hear from time to time in Western expert circles that there was, an early Putin and a late Putin, and that something, turned sour along the way. Nothing could be further from the truth. I remember the day when I realized very clearly just who this man was and what direction he was going to take our country. That day was December the 20th, 1999, the so-called Chekist Day, day of the founding of the Bolsheviks, at least the Czech, but still celebrated, astonishing, by employees of that organization. And on that day, Vladimir Putin, who was still Prime Minister of Russia, came to the Lubyanka Square in Moscow, at the site of the old KGB Maldivian, to officially unveil the memorial plaque to Yuri Andropov. Now, if you were to choose a symbol to start your rule, you could not have chosen a more potent one. because of course Andropov was somebody who epitomized the worst of the Soviet system, both in terms of the domestic repression and in terms of the external aggression. Of course, he was someone who was among the organizers of the 1956 invasion of Hungary as Soviet ambassador to Budapest, and as longtime chairman of the KGB, he was in charge of a relentless campaign of persecution of dissent in the Soviet Union. He was the one who set up the infamous fifth chief directorate of the KGB, tasked specifically with going after dissidents. He was the one who expanded the horrific practice of punitive psychiatry, when political dissenters were declared mentally insane and kept in torturous conditions in psychiatric hospitals and so on and so forth. If you choose to open a memorial plaque to that guy, there's no doubt which direction you're going to take. And very quickly, these symbols turned into actions. And by the way, in question of symbols, just in case somebody didn't get the message, in the first year of his rule, Vladimir Putin brought back the Stalin-era Soviet national anthem as a national anthem of the Russian Federation. Again, in a very clear signaling of direction. This man tells everybody what he's going to do. It's just a question of people listening or not. And very quickly, symbols turned into actions with the dismantling of independent television networks, with the falsifying of elections, with turning of parliament into a rubber stamp, with the persecution of political opponents, and so on and so forth. And it has long been a staple of Russian history that a government that engages in domestic repression will inevitably turn into outward aggression, because there's no reason to expect a regime that disregards and tramples upon the rights and freedoms of its own citizens to respect civilized norms of international behavior. Why should it? And so first came the war in Georgia in 2008. Then came the initial invasion of Ukraine, let's not forget, in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the incursion into the Donbass. Putin's military involvement in Syria, where in 2015 when his defense minister, Shoigu, infamously boasted that the Russian army has tested however many new types of weapons tested on people in the residential areas, and with the bombing of Aleppo and everything else that happened there. And then, of course, in February 22, when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine came, yeah, it was horrible, but it wasn't surprising, because this is where all of Putin's rule has led to. And I'm happy to discuss, and if that's something of interest, of whose responsibility it was for allowing this monster to grow into what it is today. But just to answering to your questioning, what changed for me when the full-scale invasion began. I remember waking up at my apartment in Moscow on the morning of the 24th of February 2022. I switched on my phone, as I think a lot of us do when we wake up, and I saw the news. I texted Evgenia, my wife, who was in the U.S., that one word, Nicholas, it started. And actually, I just remember with Tikhon, this was the last time we saw each other, because that day I was a guest in TV Rain, a program anchored by Tikhon, still in Moscow, the Moscow studio. And they were showing, I remember the footage of the bombings of Kiev, of Kharkov, I think of other cities near Petrovsk, broadcasting it live to the Russian audience. It was the last days of TV Rain's operations in Moscow. And then 2 days after that, I had my last program on Echo of Moscow radio. I had a weekly program there every Saturday, and then a few days later, both TV Rain and Echo of Moscow was shut down. And I knew then that I was not going to leave Russia, because, there are many professions nowadays which can be done from outside of the country. One of them is journalism. I think it's the duty and responsibility of journalists to work and to reach people with information from wherever they are. They're not limited by geographical sort of locations. Human rights activists can work in human rights organizations that document these crimes, that advocate for the victims of these crimes and human rights abuses. They can work from anywhere in the world, and many, many other professions. But politics is an exception. I believe that those of us who are politicians, those of us who are the public faces of the opposition movement, have a responsibility towards our fellow citizens that, frankly, is more important than any considerations of personal safety and personal comfort. Because if I am calling, as a politician, if I am calling on my fellow Russian citizens to stand up to Putin's dictatorship, well, then I have to do it myself. I have to share the risks. To me, it's a basic question of ethics. And so I knew that I wasn't going anywhere. And these laws that Tikhon spoke about were adopted in the first days of the war. And it was in late March, early April, when the arrests began of those people who publicly spoke out against the war in Ukraine and spoke of the war crimes that were being committed by Putin's forces in Ukraine. For me, it was the 11th of April of 2022. I was driving home after a meeting, and suddenly I was approaching my house, and I saw in the rear view mirror of my car, I saw there was a surveillance car following me. And of course, there's nothing new or surprising about this. If you're an opposition politician in Russia, it's normal to be followed all the time, so I didn't even pay much attention. But then as I sort of approached my house, there was a silver minivan with blackened windows parked outside the entrance. But again, I didn't pay much attention because I live in downtown Moscow. There's always people around. It was only when I stopped to push a button on my phone to open the gate to go inside to the courtyard to park, I started moving into the courtyard, and again in the rearview mirror, I saw that the doors of the minivan opened, and 6 special police force officers in black uniforms and black balaclava masks started running out of the van and running behind my car. And of course, at that moment, I realized what it was. I had time to park and send a text message to my lawyer, Vladimir Kara-Murza, that I've been arrested. At that moment, the commanding officers slashed open the door and said, Vladimir Vladimirovich, please come with us. That was the 11th of April, 2022.
My current professional activities, I cannot say that this was my choice. I think I didn't have any. Because my story is deeply personal. Just like, Vladimir and I have been together for over 20 years. And just like the war in Ukraine, in the then in 2013 to the annexation of Crimea, this story, our family's sort of trip through hell began in 2015 when first Boris Nemtsov was assassinated. He was Vladimir's close friend and colleague and godfather to our younger daughter. And then 3 months after that, Vladimir was poisoned for the first time in Moscow. He ended up in a coma with a multiple organ failure. And he was given a 5% chance to survive. He beat all the odds. It took him over a year to relearn how to walk and use a spoon. But the moment he could actually walk, like a block, he took his cane and wobbled back to Moscow. In 2017, the same thing happened. Again in Moscow, again a coma, again a multiple organ failure, everything, just all over again. And yet again brought him to the United States for physical rehabilitation. And again, it took him a while to get back to normal. And there was never even a discussion, there was never even a question whether he would go back to Russia and continue his work. I knew he would. I did not have to ask. And yes, this is exactly what he did. And so the story continued. And then there was also my work as a translator there somewhere. So yes, this was actually something that I wanted to do. I have been learning French since I was like 6. I wanted to be a French translator and interpreter. Oh my God, I love French literature. And I wanted to be a translator and interpreter. But time went on. The situation in Russia got worse and worse. And I realized that I needed to be sort of more active. I wanted to have an active position. Just being at home translating was not enough for me anymore. And I got more and more involved in Vladimir's work on political prisoners, on sanctions, doing research, translating too. But I was aware of his work and I knew exactly what he did and how he did it. Even before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we had over 300 political prisoners in the country, according to very conservative estimates by Memorial, Russia's most respected human rights organization and co-laureate of the Nobel Peace Prize. Now the number of political prisoners in Russia, according to the same Memorial, is around 800 people. And they always say that these are very conservative estimates. We're giving you these numbers, but please be aware that we simply don't have the hands to go through all the cases that we receive. And the number is at least twice, thrice as high. And according to an independent investigation by Projekt, since 2018, there have been at least 116,000 criminal prosecutions against people for speech, for just free speech. So basically there have been more political trials during Vladimir Putin's fourth presidential term alone than during the times of Brezhnev and Khrushchev combined. These numbers are staggering. So yes, more and more I got involved in that work, working behind the scenes, because, well, we have a family, we're raising a family, and I always believed, and I still continue to believe that, although now I haven't been home for almost 3 years, but I've always believed that at least one parent has to be at arm's length for the kids. Vladimir was always on the road, so I was the one at arm's length. But then in 2022, in April of 2022, Vladimir ended up behind bars. And I realized that in order to basically defend my little world, because there is always, your little world, your family, your closest friends, your relatives, and there is the bigger world around us and everything that it has. So I realized that in order to protect, to defend my little world, I had to stand up and continue Vladimir's work. That there was no way that his work on sanctions and his advocacy on political prisoners could stop while there was a full-scale war of aggression against our closest neighbor. And so this is what I have been doing for the last almost 3 years, traveling the world, speaking to politicians, leading a campaign on behalf of political prisoners, making sure that the world knows these stories, that the world knows these faces, the faces of my fellow Russian citizens whom I am proud to call my compatriots. Those Russians who show a different face of our country to the world, who show that there is a possibility of a different Russia, a more peaceful, a democratic Russia. Because these people, when they stand up and they say no, they risk very often their freedom, very often their lives to do that. And I believe that this is a high price to pay for standing up and saying no. So I need to make sure that the world knows about this, that the world knows that internal repression and external aggression are two sides of the same coin in Putin's Russia. That Vladimir Putin is leading two wars at the same time. One is a war of aggression against Ukraine, and another one is a war against Russian civil society and against Russia's future. And I am working with an amazing team of colleagues and friends from the Free Russia Foundation, a civil society organization that encourages, promotes, supports a multitude of smaller and bigger anti-war and pro-democracy initiatives, both inside of Russia and outside of the country. We work in close connection with people on the ground, and there are certain projects, like, for example, Poshuk Palon, a project that is focused on locating and representing Ukrainian POWs and civilian hostages. This project can only be carried out with the help of Russian lawyers working on the ground
who are actually the ones who locate these POWs and civilian hostages so that they can be put on exchange lists later. Out of about 4,000 exchanged Ukrainian POWs, over 900 have been located and put on the list by Russian lawyers working on the ground. We work to support a multitude of media projects in Russia. Like Vladimir and Tikhon rightly said, that there are no more big independent media available to the majority of the population, but there's still journalists working on the ground for such projects as Rus News or Sota Vision. There are independent journalists reporting from courtrooms during political trials. There are journalists who film protests in regions, and it is the work of these journalists whom we support and encourage. We work with activists who spread information, who do fundraisers for Ukraine, who support political prisoners. And outside of Russia, we make sure that all those hundreds of thousands of Russians who have been forced to leave the country fearing persecution do not feel like they do not belong anywhere, do not feel like they're useless, and everything that they feel cannot be applied, to real work. So, for example, we create these spaces called reform spaces in all of the cities where there is a big Russian-speaking population, exiled population. These are spaces that allow for this Russian-speaking community to come together, all these ordinary Russian citizens to bring their ideas to share their feelings, their ideas, their projects, their initiatives. These are the physical spaces, but these physical spaces make it possible for these people to feel like they belong, that like there is a place they can bring their ideas to, there is a place where they can come to listen to other activists' work, to journalists, to political scientists, to politicians. We make sure that these communities remain cohesive. I don't know if I'm using the right word, but so that, because it is these people who remain enthusiastic about being engaged, who remain committed despite all the challenges and risks that they're facing. It is these people that we count on to rebuild Russia when the regime collapses. It is those people we count on to return to Russia, to build a democracy there. I don't want to sound so, big, but it is true. In order for Russia to stop being a threat to itself and everyone else around it, it has to become a democracy. There are no other ways. For as long as there is a regime there, be it Vladimir Putin's regime or someone else's regime, Russia will continue being a threat to everyone. And the only possibility of changing that is by making sure that Russia becomes a peaceful, democratic, free country that respects the rights of its own citizens and lives in peace with its neighbors. And it is on those pro-democracy and Russian and anti-war Russian citizens that we depend for that.
So I would like to follow up on what Evgenia was just telling us about advocacy for political prisoners, and ask all three of you, since you've been involved in different ways in this, as someone who has spent many, many years studying the history of this advocacy, and unlike Vladimir, not having come anything close to having lived that history, but my previous book was also about political repression, this about the history of aid to political prisoners. And it strikes me that at the current moment, there are many echoes of traditions that have been established for decades and even longer. And it is, in many ways, also more sophisticated and robust today, despite the repression within Russia, than it has ever been. And so I'll ask each of you a question and then let you respond. Tikhon, if you could tell us about there have been two marathons, which are telethons, but on YouTube, that the Russian, that Dozhd, that TV Rain, and the other Russian independent media have run on. They did the first June 12th, 2023, and the second on that date this year, that have been enormously successful, and I think also mean a good deal in terms of bringing groups together that sometimes don't see eye to eye, Russian emigre opposition groups. And for Vladimir, Evgenia, you've already told us much about it, but also for Vladimir, since you've been working on this for a long time, what role this advocacy can play overall in the pro-democracy movement, what role it plays both in an immediate sense of bringing attention to the hundreds, if not thousands, of lesser-known prisoners, since Western attention, of course, always focuses on relatively well-known individuals like Alexei Navalny and yourself. And as Evgenia mentioned, now with the war, we have Ukrainian prisoners of war, hostages, Crimean Tatar activists as well. And what role the West can play beyond the exchange that just occurred. Does the West have a role to play? And I'm talking both about governments and NGOs, but also possibly private individuals.
Well, thank you so much for asking about it. I think this idea came to me right after Evgenia Berkovich was, and Evgenia Berkovich and Svetlana Petrichuk were arrested and accused of justifying terrorism or something like this. And as you may know, Russian segment of social media is pretty dark now because people are fighting with each other constantly every day. And right after Evgenia and Svetlana were arrested, there was yet another wave of fight on internet about some statements made by Evgenia a month ago or 2 months ago or whenever. And I just thought that it was a good time to stop talking and make something useful. TV Rain has a big audience, and TV Rain is not the only Russian independent media, and in exile, other medias, they have their audiences as well. And in the normal situation, we would not do anything together because we compete with each other, right? But unfortunately, we're not in a normal situation, so we have to be together because we have the common enemy, right? This is the one reason. The second reason is that I don't know how it is to sit in jail, but what I do know is that sitting in jail is very expensive. It is expensive because you have to pay for your lawyers. It is expensive because your family has to survive somehow when you are in jail, etc., etc. And the third thing is that there is a lot of Russians, a lot of Russian-speaking people outside of Russia who are sitting in the United States, in Germany, in Georgia, in France, etc., etc., and they want to do something, but they don't know what to do and how to help. And the easiest way of helping is to donate 10 euros or 100 euros or 1,000 euros to help political prisoners in Russia. So we decided to make this marathon on June 12th. June 12th is a day of Russia in Russian, which is in Russian Federation. Over last years, it's absolutely discredited by the Russian government, and we decided to give another sense to this day now. So we decided that each year we are going to make this marathon till the day when there is no need to make such marathons because there is now political prisoners in Russia, and to raise money from our viewers to help Russian political prisoners. The first marathon, I think we collected around 40 million rubles. It's around $500,000. This time it was a little less, but we were asking our viewers to make not one-time donations, but donations which are how do you say it in English? Recurrent. Yeah, thank you. Recurrent donations, because it helps us to make this construction not once in a year, but for the whole year. And so we ask families of political prisoners or their lawyers to send requests. Then a special team look into these requests, and then another special team send money and help these people. This is nothing. I mean, it is not a big deal for a person sitting somewhere in Europe, for example, to donate 5 euros. It is less than a pint of beer in Amsterdam, right? But it helps a lot, because political prisoners, they need not to be forgotten, they need to receive letters, etc., but also they need money, and this is the very little thing that we all can do together.
We're coming up in 2 weeks, exactly 2 weeks today actually, the 30th of October. It's going to be the International Day of Political Prisoners. This is a day that was established originally back in the 1970s by Soviet dissidents, Soviet political prisoners, as an annual hunger strike, both by political prisoners themselves and by people, who are not in prison, who want to demonstrate their solidarity with those in prison because of their political beliefs. About this time last year, Alexei Navalny wrote to me and to Ilya Yashin from his prison to our respective prisons. Alexei was at that time still in the Vladimir region. This was before he would be transferred to the Arctic colony where he would be killed. I was in Omsk in western Siberia, and Ilya was in Smolensk, in the southwest of Moscow. And Alexei proposed that we reinvent this tradition. We go back to marking this annual day, the 30th of October, to express solidarity with all the political prisoners in Russia, and so we did. And now it's not just in Russia, but worldwide, because a few months ago the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe passed a resolution establishing the 30th of October as International Day of Political Prisoners, and there was a similar initiative here in the United States Congress by Congressman Steve Cohen of Tennessee, who was co-chair of the U.S. Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe in Congress, to associate the U.S. with this day as well. So 2 weeks from today, 30th of October. And this day is an important focal point to pause and to think about the fact that in our world today, more than 1 million people, and these are conservative estimates, more than 1 million people are imprisoned solely because they happen to have views that differ from the views of their respective governments. In Russia, the situation is becoming not just a crisis, but a catastrophe. We have more political prisoners today in Russia alone than the whole of the Soviet Union, so that's 15 countries put together, had by the end of the communist regime in the 1980s. And this is again, according to, as Evgenia said, very conservative underestimates by human rights groups, because nobody knows the actual number. I can tell you that, having been inside the system, I've seen so many people, in pre-trial detention centers, in transit prisons, on the sleeping carriages, and so on, or in paddy wagons, people who are not on anybody's lists, who are not on the radars of any human rights groups, who are not being talked about, whose names are not known, and yet they are in prison because of a social media post, or because they stood up with a placard, or because they stood up with a blank sheet of paper expressing their opposition to the government. We have cases like this as well. And, this is not okay that in the 21st century, people are sent to prisons with longer terms than for murderers, rapists, and drug dealers, simply because they are peacefully expressing opinions that differ from the opinions of the government. Just to give you a sense of the situation in Russia, of what people are being sent to prison for. This week alone, 97 people will be tried in courtrooms across Russia politically motivated charges. Among them will be a young girl in St. Petersburg named Darya Kozlova. She's 18 years old, same age as our oldest lawyer, who came to the monument of Taras Shevchenko, Ukrainian poet, in her native St. Petersburg, with a poster quoting from his poetry from the 19th century. She was arrested on a charge of discrediting the armed forces of the Russian Federation. She's facing 5 years in prison. Alexei Goranov, the Moscow Municipal Council, got 7 years in prison for calling for a minute of silence at his council meeting for Ukrainian children killed by Russian bombs. Maria Ponomarenko, a journalist from Siberia, got 6 years in prison for writing the truth, reporting honestly about the Russian airstrike on the theater in Mariupol that left hundreds of civilians dead. Dmitry Ivanov was my neighbor in prison number 5 of Vornik in Moscow before I was transferred to Siberia. He's a talented young mathematician, a student like many of you in this room, who was arrested on the day of his final exam at Moscow State University. Before he could graduate, he got 8.5 years in prison for a few Facebook posts about Russian war crimes committed in Bucha and elsewhere in Ukraine. This is the price that people are paying. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Russians who, despite all of this, are still speaking out publicly, protesting against this war. And it's not only not okay, as I said a few minutes ago, this is also in direct contradiction to the Russian Federation's legal obligations under international law. Next year, we're coming up to the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki process, the Helsinki Final Act, which established as a fundamental principle of international law the inextricable link between security, economy, and human rights. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was founded because of the Helsinki Final Act, which includes 57 member states, including the United States and Russia, has as one of its main founding principles the notion that human rights violation in any member state of the OSCE is not a quote-unquote internal affair, like the Kremlin propaganda likes to say, but is in fact a matter of concern to all participating states, including the US. And to your question, Stuart, about what Western governments can do. According to these principles of international law, the democratic nations of this world have not just a right, but it might be a duty, not just a moral duty, but a legal duty, to act and to intervene when human rights are being violated in this despicable way. And this prisoner exchange that saved the 16 of us from the hell that is Vladimir Putin's modern-day Gulag in August, sent a very, very powerful message from the world's democracies, because not only was it the largest East-West prison exchange since the end of the Cold War, that is absolutely true, but it was also the first exchange of this kind in nearly 4 decades that actually freed Russian political prisoners from the Gulag. The last such exchange happened in October 1986, when Yuri Orlov, the founding chairman of Moscow Helsinki Group, was liberated in a similar US-Soviet exchange. This hasn't happened for 4 decades, and we cannot allow this exchange that freed us to become an exception, because so many people are left back there, so many people need rescue. For so many people, it's not just a question of unfair, politically motivated, unjust, unlawful imprisonment, which would be unacceptable in itself, but it's also a question of life or death. And the world's democracies must act. And finally, on a very practical point, I often get questions in audiences such as this one from journalists. What can, not governments, not parliaments, but what can regular citizens of democratic nations do to help political prisoners? And to this, I want to say one very simple, very practical, but very, very important thing. One thing that really helped me survive and keep my sanity in that Siberian prison was receiving letters from all over Russia, but also from all over the world. Because it's so important for a political prisoner not to feel isolated, not to feel forgotten, because that's what the whole system around you wants to make you feel, that nobody cares, that he was all for nothing, that you're just going to rot here until you die, and nobody is going to care about this. And only somebody who's been in this situation can appreciate how much warmth and how much light and how much hope there is in that small sheet of paper that the prison guard hands you through the feeding slot in your cell door. And so one thing that everybody can do is take out a few minutes from your busy schedules to write to political prisoners. There are several human rights organizations that make this easier and sort of create infrastructure for it. Amnesty International all over the world, but also specifically with regard to Russia, OVD Info, which is an independent human rights group, Memorial, which is the leading human rights organization that Evgenia mentioned. They have websites that have all the addresses and electronic forms that people can write to political prisoners. It may seem like a small thing, but trust me, it is life-saving. Please write to political prisoners.
All right, thank you so much, Vladimir. Evgenia, we are running short on time, and I really know we have a lot of questions in the audience. So I am going to ask now that those who want to ask questions, we do need microphones, it turns out. You're going to take them around, these microphones? Okay. So these microphones will be, okay. We only have two, okay. So if you have a question that you want to ask, what you're going to do is to line up, right, over here on this side of the room and on this side of the room. And we really invite and encourage students first, right, our students, but also community members. And when you come up to ask a question, make sure that you tell us who you are, right, so that our guests know who you are. And if you don't have any questions, we will go on asking them questions because we have plenty.
Yeah, go ahead. You can line up on both sides. I'll start over here, and then I'll go over to this side. But if anyone has questions, I'll take it.
Evgenia. You can, while they're lining up.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. I just wanted to give them a chance to learn. Okay.
Anybody in that side go ahead and walk that side.
We had wanted that students get to know first.
Yeah, and I said that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I said that.
So I'm going to start with providing a little bit of the context to avoid any misunderstandings and also
Did you speak up?
The microphone
and
is
also to explain the perspective from which I'm speaking. So I'm from Ukraine, and unfortunately I'm familiar with experiences of sitting in a bomb shelter and experiencing cruise missiles flying and explosions. That's why I want to, in my question, to try to translate how Ukrainians hear what you say and how Ukrainians hear your statements in order to understand each other. So for Ukrainians, it is very important that Russians understand the imperialistic nature of this war. And that's why my question is about your statements about lifting sanctions from Russia. So when Ukrainians hear that there are many people in Russia who are against war and therefore the sanctions should be lifted, meanwhile preparing for the fall of the regime, Ukrainians understand that they need to prepare for continuous sacrifices instead of Russian citizens, because Ukrainians can't just wait, but Ukrainians have to resist every single day, and Ukrainians are dying every single day. So, and in the end, it is Putin who is shifting sanctions on Russian citizens, not West or Ukraine. Moreover, Russia founded a shadow tanker fleet during all this time. Oh yes, I'm coming to the question. Sorry. So, as a Ukrainian, I believe that additional sanctions should be implied on those who actually help to circumvent the sanctions that are imposed right now. Instead of lifting them from Russia in general, because there are good people there, because it's taking the blind eye from their imperialistic nature of this war. So my question is, do you believe Russia is an empire? And a question for you as for a Russian politician, that let's imagine that assumes that the Putin's power, like the Putin regime, is no more there. What is your position regarding future of occupied territories of Ukraine, including Crimea, South Abkhazia, Transnistria, and Ossetia? Thank you.
Do you answer straight away, or do you collect questions? How are you going to do this?
So let's collect questions. Okay, one from this side. Please introduce yourself.
I'm just going to speak really loudly since I don't have a microphone.
Do you want to run over there?
Yell loud.
We hear you.
Yeah.
But hi, so my name is Jacob, and I just have a really quick question, and I was wondering, apart from international sanctions which have already been done, is there anything else that you all feel should be done by the international community to foster like democracy in Russia in general?
Еще один.
We're collecting.
Yeah, just one.
so
I think we
remember.
should.
So that we remember
So
the
that we
questions.
remember.
Hi, I'm Arian. And my question is, so freedom of information is crucial for a free society, but being exposed to accurate news isn't always enough. Russians are not an isolated people. They used to travel, consume Western media, and even live abroad. Yet many Russians have no trouble backing the Kremlin's narrative, or even parts of it. So what do you think that is, and what can dissidents, as you are, do to, mobilize Russians and change minds?
Okay, thank you very much for all the questions. I'll start with your question. I'll start with the last part of it, which is the easiest and fastest to respond about the fate of occupied territories. Needless to say, all the occupied territories will need to be returned to Ukraine. I don't see any other way. Russia has to return to its internationally recognized legal borders of 1991, including no Crimea, including no Eastern Ukraine. That's the easiest question to answer. On the sanctions, it's a much more complex question, but a very important one. First, I'm not aware of any leader of the Russian democratic movement who is calling for the lifting of sanctions. At least I've not heard anybody say that. I'm, of course, a genuine leader of the pro-democracy forces, not any fake sort of pro-Kremlin groups. What many of us are calling for, myself included, is for recalibrating the sanctions mechanism in such a way that it really targets the Putin war machine and the Putin war economy and really makes it difficult and ideally impossible for the Kremlin to continue this war. Over the past 10 weeks that I've been out of prison, I've been catching up with 2.5 years worth of information back here. And I've been shocked to see the way that the sanctions mechanisms have been organized. That's an issue that's close to my heart. Our moderators have already indicated, I work with the Magnitsky sanctions, resulting in cheap poisoning and a 25-year sentence, so that's an issue that I care deeply about. And to me, it came as a shock, for example, to see that 2.5 years into the full-scale invasion, up to 30%, these are figures from a British think tank that I saw just a couple of weeks ago, up to 30% of the military technologies used by the Russian army in Ukraine still come from Western countries or Western allied countries like Taiwan. I don't know how that's possible. 30%, not 30. I don't know how it's possible that the Russian missile that hit the children's hospital in Kiev on the 8th of July this year, or on did, contained 2 Western-produced microchips. Again, 2.5 years into the full-scale invasion. Looking at the personal side of sanctions, I was shocked by the fact that the wife of Putin's deputy defense minister continued to live in a nice apartment in Paris while the war was going on. Just a few weeks ago, the son of Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is the number 2 person in Russia, which is the Russian Dallman corporation, that provides 80% of armaments and military technologies used by the Russian army in Ukraine. His son recently took his girlfriend for a nice weekend out in Milan at the Moscow. I was shocked to read that the grandniece of Vladimir Putin also happens to be the daughter of his niece, who is the deputy defense minister of the Russian Federation, is still free to travel around countries of the European Union, which we saw in the press just a few weeks ago. And of course, the issue of the shadow technology that you mentioned, it's a way that Putin has found to circumvent the price cap of a $60 per barrel price cap introduced by G7 countries. And yet there are millions and millions of barrels of oil that are being de facto sold through this shadow tanker fleet at much higher prices, 75 and higher. And everybody sees it. It's happening in front of the eyes of the whole world, and nobody's really doing anything about it. And to me, that's completely unacceptable. Because again, to me, the purpose of these sanctions should be to target the Putin war machine, to target the Putin war economy, and to make it difficult and ideally impossible to conduct this war. And this is not happening. And so that side of sanctions should be more effective, should be tougher, and should be better enforced. Because to me, that's a clear problem with export compliance. And all the controls that are there in international law, it's a question of being implemented properly, and they're clearly not. On the other side of this, I view it as completely wrong, completely counterproductive, and frankly very short-sighted, if we're talking about strategic policy for the coming years, to treat all 140 million Russians as war criminals, because they're clearly not. And to me, it's not okay in the 21st century for countries that are based on principles of the rule of law to discriminate against an entire citizenry just on the basis of their national origin. In fact, such discrimination is expressly prohibited by Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And so when some countries in the European Union are imposing a blanket ban on all Russian citizens entering the borders, a blanket ban on all Russian citizens getting their visas, a blanket ban on all Russian citizens driving cars into their territories and so on, that makes Mr. Putin really happy. Because he was never going to drive to Estonia or the Russian number plates. But his propaganda machine, and I've been exposed to it for 2.5 years every day in my prison cell, his propaganda machine can point to these type of blanket, unsmart, and discriminatory sanctions and say, look, I've been telling you, these Westerners, they hate all Russians. They're all Russophobes. That was Putin's message over the years. And sanctions like this just make it really easy for Putin's propaganda to drive these messages through. And so, yes, I do believe, again, nobody is saying sanctions should be lifted, but they should be recalibrated in a way that will target the Putin war machine and not treat every single Russian as a war criminal, because we are. Because, we are Russian citizens, we are not war criminals. I was in prison because I opposed this war. So was Ilya Yashin, so was Andrei Pivovar, so was Oleg Orlov from Memorial on that plane with us, so was Sasha Skoshenko, an artist from St. Petersburg, whom today early when we met the students, there was a group of students here at Dartmouth College that was corresponding with her in prison, and she's out now because of our prisoner exchange as well. Not every Russian is a war criminal. I sort of find it strange to need to say that, but I guess we do when we hear narratives like this. And leading into the question from the gentleman on that side, what can Western governments do more effectively to help bring about the day when there is democracy in Russia? I will name 3 things. First, continue to support Ukraine, because the Putin regime has to lose this war. That's been my message and the message from me and my colleagues from Denmark. The Putin regime cannot be allowed to win this war. The Putin regime cannot be allowed to have a face-saving exit from this war. Because if it is, that means that, a year or 2 months from now, there'll be something else, there'll be another aggression, another invasion, because this man is not going to stop until he's stopped. He's shown us in 25 years of his rule. Number 2, what we just discussed, recalibrate sanctions in a way that really hit Putin's war machine and do not discriminate against every single Russian, thus making it really easy for Putin's propaganda. And the third thing, which may sound really sort of simple, but sometimes words are the most powerful thing there is. And I think it's really important that the free world finds a way to message, to communicate with the people of Russia over the heads of the Putin regime and the Kremlin propaganda, to send a message that the core of the democratic world is not with all 140 million Russians, but with this murderous clique that is sitting in the Kremlin. That was the way, for example, the US President Ronald Reagan messaged the peoples of the then Soviet Union during the Cold War, to make a distinction between the dictatorship and society. We should have more of that today. And there should be clear messaging from the free world to Russian citizens that life will be better for Russians without and after Putin than it is today. And that's really important. And that, by the way, is not just sort of, a one-way move that will be important, but to go back to everything that we've been speaking about on this panel today. The only strategic solution to all of this, to everything that we're talking about today, will be a democratic Russia. For as long as there is an authoritarian, murderous, aggressive, dictatorial regime in the Kremlin, Russia will continue to be a threat to its own people, to neighboring countries, and frankly to the whole of Europe and the whole of the world. The only way to achieve security, stability, and peace on the European continent in the long term, the only way we could ever have Europe whole, freedom, and peace lies through a democratic Russia. Once there is a government in Russia that would respect the rights both of its own people and would respect the civilized norms of international behavior. This is the only strategic solution. This is in the interest of everyone, and that's what we should be working towards.
I would like to add a few words, if any, because I really want that there will be no misunderstanding. No one says that sanctions should be lifted per se, no. But sanctions should be smart. There should be sanctions, and these sanctions should be smart and they should be effective. And another important thing, there should be no hypocrisy. Because when I hear that the Prime Minister of Estonia says that all the sanctions against Russians should be imposed, and then I see that her husband is having business with Russia, then I think that something is wrong. Or when I'm saying that sanctions should be smart, I mean that sometimes I feel that sanctions are imposed only to be imposed. When Alexei Navalny was killed in the prison, it's not about Ukraine now, when Alexei Navalny was killed in the prison, Great Britain imposed sanctions against the men who worked in this prison. They banned them from entering Great Britain. I think they don't have passports to go to the Great Britain. And they sanctioned them against having bank accounts in the UK. That's ridiculous. The same thing goes with the sanctions against all the Russians from entering Baltic states and Poland. Because Russian propagandist Vladimir Posner has 3 passports, American, Russian, and French. People from inner circle of Vladimir Putin, they have European passports because they bought them before. Because the European Union was happy to sell these passports for the investment. And another thing, sanctions, for example, there are sanctions against the selling components for bombs to the Russian Federation. Okay, they are not selling it directly, they are selling it through Kazakhstan or through India. And who found it? It was found by Russian journalists from important stories media. And only after that, State Department started to do something with it. So sanctions, it is a process. It is not like, okay, we impose sanctions, good, let's go. No, that's what we're talking about. Sanctions should be smart, because otherwise they would be counterproductive, and people in Russia would be brainwashed by the propaganda. Who needs this? Only Vladimir Putin.
I want to add, there was also the question about Russia's future. Actually, we should talk about the possibility of Russia's future, but yes, we believe that there is this potential, and how we can bring this change in Russia, how we can make sure that it stops being an evil state that brings murder and pain and misery everywhere. And in this regard, I think it is very important to think about the 1990s and the mistakes that were made after the collapse of the Soviet Union by then leaders. And one of the biggest mistakes, and Vladimir wrote about it a while ago for the Washington Post. Actually, that was one of the articles that he was given a Pulitzer for, about a specific huge mistake that was made in the early 1990s, and a mistake that we can never ever afford repeating. And that was the unwillingness of then leaders, the unpreparedness and unwillingness of then leaders, led by Boris Yeltsin himself, to go through the whole process of reckoning, the whole process of denunciation, condemning all the crimes committed during the Soviet period. There were no illustrations, no public trials. The archives were opened for a very short period and then everything was just closed down again. The work of Memorial, that is extremely important, the Memorial Center for Human Rights, never became sort of a part of the state's policies. Kids were not taken on trips to the Gulag. They were not told about mass executions. And actually under Putin, that activity that is focused on bringing the truth to the people about the crimes committed during the Soviet times is yet again persecuted harshly. I will give you one example. Yuri Dmitriev, a historian with Memorial, who uncovered and meticulously documented the crimes committed during the Stalin era, mass executions in Karelia. He was thrown in prison and sentenced to 15 years for that, because today's regime in the Kremlin does not want to know that truth, and we need to tell this truth. And we will need those public trials over all of those who have been committing war crimes in Ukraine just as much as Ukrainians need these trials. Because this is going to be one of the major components of our work to open the eyes of the Russian population so that those people who have been brainwashed or who were silent for any other reasons, so that they understand what was done with a silent approval. We need to go through those processes, and the history tells us that that former Soviet countries of the Soviet bloc that went through some processes like this in different shapes and forms, they were much more successful with their democratic transitions. And in our country, where even the secret services were not dismantled but just renamed KGB to FSB, in our country, just 8-9 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a KGB officer came to power again. So we can never repeat that mistake again. And that process of reckoning, that process of official condemnation, the punishment of those crimes has to happen so that we get a chance at building a democracy in Russia. Without that, democracy in Russia will not be possible, I'm afraid.
All right, so we were so thrilled to have the opportunity to listen to Evgenia, Vladimir, and Tikhon, and delighted to have you here with us. We thank you for your questions and welcome you. If you have anything you didn't have the opportunity to ask, our guests will be here for a short while after we end our program in 1 minute. So please feel free to come and chat for a bit if you have an unasked question that you would like to answer. And thanks again.